All right, so welcome to the Liz Wheeler Show. I'm your host, Liz Wheeler. Forget the fact that it's Tuesday today? Happy Taylor Swift engagement day. Guess what? We're not talking about that on the show today. No, sir, absolutely not. What are we talking about? We're talking about President Trump. President Trump signed an executive order yesterday titled, and I'm quoting, prosecuting burning of the American flag. And let me tell you, the signing of that executive order set off a firestorm, but not from the left. You might think, oh, President Trump's opposition hated it. No. The fiery response to President Trump's executive order is coming from President Trump's base, who are all ablaze about this. Now, you're going to be surprised by what I think about this topic. My stance on this might catch you off guard. And so what I want to do to start the show today is I want to start with a poll. I want you to weigh in the comment section, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're watching on Facebook, whether you're watching on Rumble, whether you're watching on X. I want you to weigh in. Do you support President Trump's executive order on flag burning, or do you oppose it, and why? Get those fingers flying. Type in the comments. I want to hear what you think because, like I said, my position on this might come as some surprise to you. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Crowd Health. What if you could get healthcare for under $100? Now, you've heard me talk extensively about Crowd Health because I love them. My husband and I quit our health insurance. I guess it was almost a year ago. It's been like 9 or 10 months ago because health insurance is a scam. You pay these enormous premiums. You never reach your deductible. And then when you do have a health event that you need covered, they deny your claim. It's an absolute scam. And we said, enough. There's a better way. Well, I want to tell you today about something new that Crowd Health has just introduced. You can finally rid yourself of the bureaucracy of the healthcare system and take agency over your own health. Crowd Health just introduced what they're calling the Black Swan membership. What is that? Well, it's the healthcare alternative for people who want autonomy over their care, their costs, and their lifestyle. They just need a little help with the Black Swan events that do happen in our lives. For just $95 a month, you get access to a team of health bill negotiators, low-cost prescription and lab testing tools, and a database of low-cost, high-quality doctors vetted by Crowd Health. You stay in control without insurance and their networks dictating your care. And what if something major does happen to you or to a member of your family? Well, in that case, you pay the first $15,000 and then the crowd, that's me and my family and others like us, step in to help fund the rest. It actually feels a lot like the options that we used to have before Obamacare messed everything up. And if you use my code Liz, it's only $80 for the first 3 months. Visit joincrowdhealth.com, use promo code Liz. The mandatory disclaimer here is Crowd Health is not insurance. I personally like to call it assurance. Opt out. Take your power back. This is how we defeat the system. Visit joincrowdhealth.com. Use promo code Liz. Okay, so while you're busy weighing in the comments section, telling me whether you support President Trump's executive order on prosecuting burning of the American flag or whether you oppose this and why, here are the two most convincing arguments, and they're on opposing sides of this position. So the first argument about President Trump's executive order is what I call the Scalia argument, the free speech argument. This would be those of you who are very much opposed to President Trump's executive order on the grounds that, listen, you never want to burn the American flag. You probably have never considered it. You might even be offended by it. You oppose it. You think those that burn the American flag in our streets are scum. However, you believe that it's an individual's right, their First Amendment right to free speech, to do so. And so you don't agree with his executive order on that grounds. Now, Antonin Scalia, the late, great Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, was asked about this actually by a very young Piers Morgan. You'll notice him in the clip. It's kind of funny to see him from decades ago. Antonin Scalia was asked about whether or not burning the American flag is a constitutionally protected First Amendment right. And this was his answer. Take a listen.
If I were king, I would not allow people to go about burning the American flag. However, we have a First Amendment which says that the right of free speech shall not be abridged, and it is addressed in particular to speech critical of the government. I mean, that was the main kind of speech that tyrants would seek to suppress. Burning the flag is a form of expression. Speech doesn't just mean written words or oral words. It could be semaphore. Burning a flag is a symbol that expresses an idea. I hate the government is unjust, whatever.
If you're not sure, then in the end, and no one knows the Constitution better than you do, doesn't it come down to your personal interpretation of the Constitution? If it isn't clear-cut, which it clearly isn't, you in the end have to make an opinion, don't you?
Well, don't forget this person has to be convicted by a jury of 12 people who unanimously have to find that he was inciting to riot. So, it's not all up to me. It would be up to me to say that there was not enough evidence for the jury to find that, perhaps. But ultimately, the right of jury trial is the protection.
First of all, how much do you miss that man? Listening to him, hearing his voice, my goodness, the country lost a great man when they lost Justice Scalia. Okay, so he presents his argument that, you may not want to burn the American flag. You may hate when other people do it, but this is the purpose of the First Amendment, to protect people who want to vehemently criticize or dissent against the government. And there are a lot of prominent conservatives who are staking out this position. Clay Travis, for example, on X, he says, quote, "I believe burning all flags should be legal. American flags, gay and trans pride flags, BLM flags, Israel flags, Palestine flags, and especially Alabama football flags. It's protected speech as long as you own the flag." He then follows up and says, "I wouldn't personally choose to burn any flags, but I don't believe you should go to prison for doing so." That got a lot of traction online. Likewise, Jesse Kelly, and this tweet went very viral. Jesse Kelly said, "I would never in a million years harm the American flag, but a president telling me I can't has me as close as I'll ever be to lighting one on fire. I'm a free American citizen, and if I feel like torching one, I will. This is garbage," Jesse Kelly says. So the crux of this argument is that dissent of government is our constitutionally protected right, and it's super important. And listen, I get this. That's what we do every day on this show. We criticize the government and government officials, usually on the left, sometimes on the right, when they deserve it, when they're part of the uniparty or when they make a misstep here. Believe me, I fully appreciate the argument that if we give the power to the government to label certain speech not free speech, when we have the power in government on the right, then the left is certainly going to use that opportunity when they have power sometime in the future to criminalize our dissent, if we've criminalized their dissent. I understand that. I appreciate that. I have literally been the target of censorship, so this is something personal to me. I'm very sympathetic to this point of view, the point of view that I just presented. The counter-argument, however, to what I would call the Scalia free speech argument, the counter-argument goes something like this. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, and we in the United States are not living in ordinary times. We are facing a deliberate, concerted assault on everything, from the very legitimacy of our country to our rule of law to our constitutionally protected rights. And the other side, our political opposition, has been tragically very successful in waging these attacks against us. This is the counter argument to the free speech argument. The counter argument says, listen, this narrative that you hear from the free speechers that says that this is a long-standing Supreme Court precedent protecting the burning of the American flag as free speech, that's actually not true. This is a very recent ruling. It happened only in 1989 in a Supreme Court case called Texas versus Johnson. So this was 36 years ago that this ruling took effect that defined burning the American flag as protected free speech. So the first 200 years of our country, it wasn't considered constitutionally protected free speech to light the American flag on fire. In addition to that, in Texas versus Johnson, this wasn't a unanimous 9-0 ruling. It was a very close ruling. It was split 5-4. And the different justices who ruled on each side of this, it was actually the liberal justices who ruled in the majority opinion, except Scalia. Scalia ruled with the 5 are in that 5-vote majority, and the 4 justices in the minority who dissented from this, who said, actually, no, burning the flag is not constitutionally protected free speech, they were the conservatives, like Chief Justice Rehnquist, for example, voted in that minority. So when people say the Scalia position of free speech, I don't know what that means. That could also mean the Harry Blackmun position. Harry Blackmun was one of those 5 Supreme Court justices who voted that you can burn the American flag. But Harry Blackmun was the chief author of Roe v. Wade. He invented the right to abortion. He and Scalia happen to have the same position on this. You could also say the Scalia position. I support the Scalia position. Well, the Scalia position was also the Anthony Kennedy position. Justice Anthony Kennedy was one of those 5 justices who voted that you can burn the flag. It's constitutionally protected free speech. Years down the line, Anthony Kennedy also authored Obergefell, inventing the so-called constitutional right for 2 men to get married. So the Scalia position is also the position of Supreme Court justices who have no grip whatsoever on the U.S. Constitution. This is not at all an attack on Justice Scalia, who I like and respect and admire, but actually our vice president, J.D. Vance, said it best when he said a few things. Number one, Antonin Scalia was a great Supreme Court justice and a genuinely kind and decent person. Number two, the president, meaning President Trump's executive order, is consistent with Texas versus Johnson. And number three, Texas versus Johnson was wrong, and William Rehnquist was right. William Rehnquist, of course, voted in that minority in that case. So the way that the counter argument flows from here is that, listen, in Washington, D.C., when those teenagers on their bikes made those burnouts on top of the trans flag that was painted on the roads, they faced potential 10 years in prison for defacing the trans flag. Why should the left's sacred symbols, the trans flag, be protected, but our sacred symbols, the American flag, not? That doesn't seem like equality under the law. That seems like a double standard where their religious symbols are protected and ours aren't. And when we're talking about this slippery slope argument that the free speech on the free speech side of this debate, the slippery slope argument says, if we use our position when we're in power in government to stifle their dissent, then they're going to use their power to stifle our dissent. If we call the burning of the American flag violence instead of free speech, then when they're in power, they're going to call our speech violence. But wait a second. They already did. This is not some hypothetical possibility that might happen down the road that we have to protect against. The left has already called your speech violent. In memos behind the scenes at the FBI, if you're a parent that opposed critical race theory or trans ideology in a public school, if you're a pro-lifer, if you're a Catholic, they've labeled you a violent extremist, a domestic terrorist. They've already used our observation that what happened during the 2020 presidential election was fishy. You say that, and the left says, oh, you're inciting an insurrection. They've already taken our speech and told us that it's violence and prosecuted us for it. So the slippery slope argument may sound good on paper. It may be convincing. You may feel sympathetic to it on paper. But in reality, that's long past relevant. In addition to the fact that there are already laws on our books that prohibit the desecration of symbols, of American symbols, and we have not contested this as a violation of our free speech. I'm going to give you a concrete example. There is a law, federal law, that says that American citizens are not allowed to burn money. If you take, a dollar bill in your own home, you can burn it. That's fine. But if you take a dollar bill and you publicly burn it with the intent of damaging it to the point so that it cannot be circulated anymore, say you're protesting the Federal Reserve or fiat currency itself, that's illegal. So how can an act like that, an act of arson like that, not be protected free speech if it's dissent of the government, but somehow burning the American flag is protected free speech? There's a contradiction here. And as you can see, this argument, the counter argument, is also very convincing. So the question today is, what is the right position? Which of these two very convincing arguments, which is correct? And the answer to that My answer to that, the obvious answer to that, might surprise you. The answer to that is read the executive order. Bring it up on the screen right now. This is President Trump's executive order. And it seems to be that many people didn't bother to read past the title, because the title, Prosecuting Burning of the American Flag, is not actually what's contained in the executive order itself. Let's read this. President Trump says, by the authority vested in me as president, by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered, our great American flag is the most sacred and cherished symbol of the United States of America and of American freedom, identity, and strength. Over nearly 2.5 centuries, many thousands of American patriots have fought, bled, and died to keep the stars and stripes waving proudly. The American flag is a special symbol in our national life that should unite and represent all Americans of every background and walk of life. Desecrating it is uniquely offensive and provocative. It's a statement of contempt, hostility, and violence against our nation. The clearest possible expression of opposition to the political union that preserves our rights, liberty, and security. Burning this representation of America may incite violence and riots. American flag burning is also used by groups of foreign nationals as a calculated act to intimidate and threaten violence against Americans because of their nationality and place of birth. Notwithstanding the Supreme Court's rulings on First Amendment protections, the court has never held that American flag desecration conducted in a manner that is likely to incite imminent lawless action or that is an action amounting to fighting words is constitutionally protected. See Texas versus Johnson. President Trump writes, my administration will act to restore respect and sanctity to the American flag and prosecute those who incite violence or otherwise violate our laws while desecrating this symbol of our country to the fullest extent permissible under any available authority. So let's stop right there for a second. That paragraph is key. Because you know and I know that the President of the United States cannot unilaterally declare something to be a crime. That has to be legislated. That has to pass through Congress. That has to be signed into law by the Chief Executive, the President of the United States. That's not what this executive order is doing. This executive order is not declaring the burning of the American flag to be a crime. This executive order is not bypassing Congress or ignoring Supreme Court precedent. What this executive order is doing, what President Trump signed into law, is extremely specific. I want to read this phrase again. My administration will prosecute those who incite violence or otherwise violate our laws while desecrating this symbol of our country to the fullest extent permissible under any available authority. So what does this mean? If you're inciting violence, if you are violating other laws while burning the American flag, this executive order is a message to you that the Trump administration recognizes, just like you and I recognize, because it's right before our very eyes, that those who burn the American flag are bad people. That those who burn the American flag, especially within the last days and weeks and months and years, are doing so not to dissent from a government policy, but because they are subversives, because they hate America. They want to destabilize our nation because they want it to topple. They want to burn down our country. It's never been permissible in the United States to engage in subversive efforts to overthrow the seat of American government. That's always been against the law, just like inciting violence has always been against the law. So President Trump in this executive order is not saying that he is unilaterally declaring the burning of the American flag to be some new crime without going through the proper legislative process. He's saying we recognize that thugs and criminals and foreign nationals who are burning the American flag while chanting death to America in the streets of our country, we recognize that what you're doing is not isolated to that particular action. He's saying, by burning the flag, you're sending a signal to us to watch you very closely. That when you burn the American flag, we will look for the other crimes that you are committing, and we will prosecute you for those crimes. Because when you burn the American flag, you're showing us that the rule of law, which underpins, it's the fabric of our nation, means nothing to you. And make no mistake, they will find other crimes surrounding the burning of the American flag. So the executive order continues and says, the Attorney General shall prioritize the enforcement to the fullest extent possible of our nation's criminal and civil laws against acts of American flag desecration that violate applicable content-neutral laws while causing harm unrelated to expression consistent with the First Amendment. This may include, but is not limited to, violent crimes, hate crimes, illegal discrimination against American citizens, or other violations of American civil rights, and crimes against property and the peace, as well as conspiracies and attempts to violate and aiding and abetting others to violate such laws. So again, is the president chilling speech with his executive order? Is he bypassing the legislature? Is he criminalizing dissent? Not at all. This reaction from Trump's base saying this makes me want to burn the American flag, even though I hate the idea of burning the American flag, or it should be everyone's right. That's not what this question is at all. Read past the title of the executive order. Read past the title, and I suspect even those with the most emotional reaction opposing what they thought President Trump's executive order to be wouldn't oppose this. President Trump writes, in cases where the Department of Justice or another executive department or agency determines that an instant of American flag desecration may violate an applicable state or local law, such as open burning restrictions, disorderly conduct laws, or destruction of property laws, the agency shall refer the matter to the appropriate state or local authority for potential action. Okay, so there are laws on the books already that those who are engaging in burning of the American flag are probably violating. Get them on those grounds. That's what this executive order is saying. He goes on to say, to the maximum extent permitted by the Constitution, the Attorney General shall vigorously prosecute those who violate our laws in ways that involve desecrating the American flag and may pursue litigation to clarify the scope of the First Amendment exceptions in this area. So let me ask you now. We have these two opposing arguments, the Scalia argument, the free speech argument. You should be able to burn it if you want to, versus the other argument that says, why should conservatives or right-wingers face 10 years in prison, or the possibility of 10 years in prison for making a burnout with a tire on a trans flag on the street in Washington, D.C.? Why should their sacred symbol be protected but not ours? They already call our speech violent. These two very convincing opposing arguments are a completely moot point when you read the executive order. So my question to you is this. After reading the executive order, did your answer change? If you said, no, I'm totally against this, I don't support burning the American flag, but I'm a free speech absolutist, I strongly oppose President Trump's executive order. Once you read it, did you change your mind? If you're losing your mind about this executive order, I highly encourage you, I challenge you to read it because it's nuanced. Yeah, the title makes it sound like something different. President Trump's words in the executive office made it sound like something that, frankly, it's not. Because this executive order is not criminalizing the burning of the American flag. It is a call to action, a prioritization of the executive branch of government. That's what an executive order is supposed to do, giving direction to executive agencies to look for the crimes, the other crimes committed by those who are desecrating the American flag. So if you're lashing out saying flag burning shouldn't be criminalized, Trump's being authoritarian, then you are telling me that you haven't actually read the executive order, because the executive order doesn't criminalize flag burning. I'm going to read this paragraph to you again. My administration will act to restore respect and sanctity to the American flag and prosecute those who incite violence or otherwise violate our laws while desecrating this symbol of our country to the fullest extent permissible under any available authority. I told you my position on this might surprise you because I truly am sympathetic to both of those arguments in the binary choice. The free speech absolutist, heck yeah, I have a right to dissent from the government. Don't you dare tell me that my words are inciting violence when I am just contradicting the swamp creatures. I'm very sympathetic to that. Of course I'm sympathetic to that. That's what we do on this show. I'm also very sympathetic to the argument that extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, and we should not play by a different set of rules than the left, unless, of course, we're talking about violating the Constitution. However, the narratives that surround the free speech argument that says that this is longstanding Supreme Court precedent, that's not true. This was not longstanding Supreme Court precedent, and it was mostly leftist justices who voted that it was constitutionally protective. I find that very convincing, to be honest, very convincing. But the surprising part of this is you don't actually have to choose between those binary options, because that's not what we're facing right now. What we're facing is President Trump telling those who burn the flag, I see you. I see the message that you're sending, that you hate America, that you're trying to destroy us by destroying our symbols, and I will find the other crimes that you are committing, and I will get you for those crimes. Because they're breaking our laws that are already on the books. In addition to the fact, I'm also highly sympathetic to J.D. Vance's point when he says the president's executive order is consistent with Texas versus Johnson. Antonin Scalia was a great Supreme Court justice, but Texas versus Johnson was wrong and William Rehnquist was right. I think J.D. Vance, we don't love J.D. Vance enough. We love him a lot. We don't love him enough. Because when he offers takes like this, he just distills it, synthesizes it into the correct take. When you burn the flag, you are sending a literal smoke signal to the Department of Justice that you want to be a big blip on their radar. That is the point of this executive order. Okay, as it turns out, the panicans were wrong again, as President Trump calls them, the haters and the losers. The panicans were wrong about tariffs. This is according to the Congressional Budget Office. This is what they say. As of August 19th, we estimate that the effective tariff rate for goods imported into the United States has increased about 18 percentage points when measured against 2024 trade flows. We project that increases in tariffs implemented during the period from January 6th, 2025 to August 19th will decrease primary deficits, which exclude net outlays for interest, by $3.3 trillion if the higher tariffs persist for the 2025 to 2035 period. By reducing the need for federal borrowing, this is the important part, listen very closely, those tariff collections will also reduce federal outlays for interest by an additional $0.7 trillion. As a result, the changes in tariffs will reduce total deficits by $4 trillion altogether. Period. Journey back with me just months ago. Early this summer, when President Trump began levying tariffs against countries that we trade with because countries around the world take advantage of us in trading and it's not fair. It hurts us and there's no reason for it. Countries do it just because they can, because they've been allowed to get away with it in the past. And President Trump said, listen, no more. You want to trade with the most powerful economy in the world? Then you're going to trade with us on our terms. And people freaked out. They said tariffs are taxes. They said this is going to start a global economic recession. They said we're never going to recover from this. Well, it turns out they were always wrong, but now they've been proven to be wrong. But I say this because, sure, those of us who said tariffs are awesome all along, yeah, we were right, and it's good to be right. But I don't mean to spike the football in that sense, because a lot of us were skeptical of tariffs years ago. I think it was back in 2019, as X loves to bring up, back in 2019, I had a post that said a tariff is an effective tax on the American people, and I believed that until I learned how tariffs can be used in order to make trading with foreign nations fair, when tariffs are not viewed as an end, but a means to an end. The end being a fairer trading agreement. So I want to bring on a very special guest today to talk about the numbers and the nuances of the impact that tariffs are having on you, on things that you're buying, on places that you spend, because of course there's always going to be a lot of fake news surrounding tariffs, both from the other side as we begin to enter the midterm election season, and even from never Trumpers within the Republican Party. So with me now is a friend of mine. He's a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute. I offered to introduce him as the author of all the best-selling books on the New York Times best-selling list, but he declined being introduced like that. It's Justin Haskins. Justin, good to see you. Happy Taylor Swift engagement day.
I'm so high on the Taylor Swift thing. I haven't come down yet. It's just sinking in. But I hope you bring me back so we can talk about all the ramifications for the country about that, because that really is the top story of the day, obviously. So.
Oh, quite obviously. Brett Cooper had a funny post, actually. This is probably the funniest post. I don't even know if I can bring it up, but the effective points of her post. She said, well, if anyone in politics wants to release a story that doesn't get any press at all, right now would be the time.
Now would be the time. Now is a good time to drop that scandal you've had in the closet. So any skeletons you got, bring them on out today. Today's the day.
I actually wouldn't put it past politicians over the course of the next 18 hours. It's a funny tweet from Brett Cooper, but there's also some truth in it, which is probably why it's funny. I could see that happening. All right. Well, as we wait with bated breath to find out the wedding plans of Taylor Swift, or to see the scandals that the Democrats, or maybe even uniparty Republican swamp creatures, who knows, are going to try to brush under the rug here. Let's talk about tariffs. Let's talk about the impact of tariffs after, the months that they have been in effect. The warnings that we heard about a global economic trade war haven't come true. What do you make of this CBO projection about the deficit over the course of the next decade? And what are we seeing when it comes to our, not just the political ramifications, but the implications to us as consumers? We were told all these things were going to be more expensive as a result of tariffs. What are we actually seeing right now?
Yeah, all the fear mongering was totally wrong. It was just totally and completely wrong. Obviously, in the future, we can't predict with certainty 6 months down the road what will happen. But as of right now, the data that we have clearly shows that the tariffs that have gone into effect have not dramatically increased prices for consumers. We obviously are not in the midst of an economic catastrophe or something like that. And of course, as you pointed out with the CBO report, revenues are up, tax revenues are up. That's a good thing because we have a gigantic deficit problem in this country and a gigantic government debt problem long-term, and this could be a potential solution to that. But just to give people a sense of, because if you just were to Google the story and look around the internet, you'll see people say that the tariffs are causing lots of inflation. You'll see it in headlines all over the place. And I want to give real data from the government that proves that that's not the case. The first point is, if you look at the inflation rate, CPI inflation rate, that's the standard used for measuring inflation in July. The 12-month inflation rate from July 2024 to 2025, 2.7%, is basically the same as in June. That's less than what it was in December and in January before Trump was even president. So at that point, it was around 3%. So the inflation has actually gone down over the past 8 months if you're just comparing it in that way. If you start looking at individual numbers, parts of the economy, prices, CPI prices in specific parts of the economy where you would expect to see tariffs causing inflation, if tariffs do cause inflation, you're not seeing it. So for example, with apparel like clothing and stuff like that, we are seeing prices actually go down a little bit, even though 97% of all clothing in the United States is imported into the United States. So if tariffs are causing inflation, then you would think that would be one area where you'd expect to see prices soaring, and we're not seeing that. When you look at new cars, we haven't seen any change in car prices, despite there being tariffs levied on foreign cars. We're not seeing it when you look at import prices. So the actual price that importers are paying, or exporters are paying, or importers when they're buying products from exporters, those prices before the tariffs are applied are not going up either. In fact, they're going down. The import prices related to China, products coming to America from China, are actually around 2 to 3% less than they were a year ago. In Mexico, it's somewhere around 9%, 10%, depending on what part you're looking at, what kinds of exports you're talking about. So we're just not seeing anything that would indicate that tariffs are causing lots of inflation. So the inflation that does exist, what is causing that? Well, actually, the government is really clear about that. It's housing. Housing is where the primary driver of inflation. And the irony of all of this is that just the justification from the Federal Reserve for keeping interest rates high is that they need to battle inflation. But the primary driver of inflation is the fact that housing prices are high, and that's all tied into the interest rates that the Fed is putting into place. So they're actually creating the problem that they think they're trying to solve. And the data is so incredibly clear about that. And yet dishonest people in the media continue to say that tariffs are causing all of these problems, when in reality, the evidence is clear that they're not.
Well, I just Googled it for the fun of it, and you're exactly right. This is a headline from Fortune. It's time to unmask the Trump tariffs for what they really are, a giant national sales tax. From ABC News, Trump vows to impose furniture tariffs. What would that mean for prices? CNN, sneakflation, how Trump's tariffs are gradually raising costs for Americans. So yes, the mainstream media is lying. I have a couple of questions based on what you said. My first question is, if you look at, and let's use the clothing example that you get, apparel. Most apparel, I think, that Americans wear is not American made. Most of that is made in other countries. So you would think that clothing prices would go up based on tariffs, if tariffs were going to have that effect. If it not only hasn't had the effect of raising the price of apparel, but we've actually seen apparel prices go down, what's the cause of that?
Right. Well, the tariffs are actually the cause of that. That's part of the reason why it's happening. See, if you're exporting products into the United States and you know that you're going to have to pay these tariffs, that means your products are going to be sold in the United States for more money, and it's going to price you out of competitors that come from countries that are not being they don't have as high tariffs, or U.S. manufacturers. So what do you do about that? You try to lower prices if you can. And so you either eat the cost yourself as the manufacturer, or maybe you take those costs and you spread them out to consumers in other countries as a way of dealing with that. Or maybe you figure out a way to be more efficient or whatever, but you try to figure out a way. The first step for you is not to just jack up prices, because that makes you less competitive with the other people in the global marketplace. The first step you try to do is figure out a way to either eat the costs or pass it along to somebody else, so that you don't have that problem in the United States, which is the number one consumer market in the world by far. So you don't want to mess with that relationship. And by the way, it's run by a president who absolutely would not like it if suddenly your country started jacking up all the prices on products. He might actually increase tariffs even more. And so the threat of that is keeping prices from going crazy off the wall. That's part of the reason why the prices are not dramatically increasing. It's because of the tariffs. I think there's a pretty good argument to be made, because we've seen this with pharmaceuticals actually hurting the United States. I'm sure you're aware of this. Pharmaceuticals in the United States, we pay far more for pharmaceuticals than basically anywhere else in the world. Many countries in the world have rules and policies in place that make it impossible, price controls for consumers to pay too much for pharmaceuticals relative. Now, I'm not in favor of price controls, but that's what they do in places like the European Union. And what has happened is drug manufacturers say, okay, well, maybe we can't get as much money as we want in the EU, but we'll just continue to jack up the prices in the United States because of the policies they have in the EU. I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that some of that is going on right now, that exporters in places like China, they're eating some of the costs, and they're also spreading out the costs to other countries where they don't have somebody like Donald Trump in charge, there's going to be retribution if they just start jacking up prices against the US. That's not good for them. And so I think they're looking down the road and they're saying, well, how do we avoid that? Maybe it is worth just eating some of the costs and not raising prices so that we can keep our market share in the United States.
All of this, what you're saying, reminds me of that hat that President Trump's been wearing recently. It's red like a MAGA hat, but it says Trump was right about everything. It's playing out before our very eyes. And I say this again, I'm not saying this like, panicans were wrong. I'm saying this because listen to what President Trump's strategy is before you dismiss it. Because sometimes this guy, he's been talking about tariffs for decades. He knows what he's doing. The housing market comment that you made a few moments ago, talk to me about that. So I find that very interesting. President Trump seems to be putting some concerted efforts on the Fed to lower the interest rates. I think we would all love if interest rates were lowered, especially people who want to buy homes for their families. Do you see this coming? And if so, is that what would reduce the inflation rate even lower than it is right now?
I think it is going to come. I think it's inevitable. I think the Fed is realizing, even though they're not going to say it, that they were wrong about the tariffs. And because they were wrong about the tariffs, I think there's a less fear that if they reduce interest rates, that means that you're going to see inflation soar. I don't think that they really believe that anymore. And so I do think there's going to be a reduction in interest rates. I don't think it's going to be crazy, but there is going to be a reduction in interest rates. I think overall that is a really good thing. Frankly, the federal government needs that to happen to finance all of their massive debt, which is another issue, but they have to have that. But what people need to understand about the housing market is the housing market has gone through an unprecedented increase over the past several years. It happened under the Biden administration. Ironically, it started during Biden's time in COVID. We're still in the COVID period. Prices skyrocketed by over $100,000, the average sales price in the United States. And they have remained insanely high ever since. Right now is one of the highest times in history for people to be able to buy a home. The prices are higher than they've ever been relative to what people are earning in income and in raw numbers. So it takes basically 7 to 8 times the average person's income to buy a new house. The only other time we reached 7% or came even close to it was right before the market crashed during the Great Recession 2007-2008 period. That was the only other time in history that that's happened. So housing prices are insanely high. Then, because we had this inflation crisis that happened during Biden's era, the Fed raised interest rates. So they raised interest rates, which means it's more expensive to have a mortgage, even on top of the high housing prices. So we had high housing prices and we had really high interest rates relative to what they've been in the past. And that's created this insane level of cost for people who are trying to buy a house. It's never been more unaffordable for people to buy a house. So they have to come down. And if they come down, I do think the entire U.S. economy is going to benefit dramatically. Inflation might go up a little bit because of that, just because of the economic growth. But I don't think it's going to hurt the economy by any means. And I think average people will dramatically be helped by it.
When do you predict that will happen if there's a reduction in interest rate? And I know you said you don't think it'll be a huge reduction, but give us an idea of how much you think it'll be reduced by.
Yeah, so the markets have already started pricing in the idea that the Fed in their next meeting is going to reduce interest rates by at least a quarter percentage point, maybe 0.5 percentage points. So we're going to see a decrease in inflation or a decrease in interest rates at the next Fed meeting. So
when is that?
And I don't know off the top of my head. It's coming up.
We'll have to look that up. It's pretty soon though.
Yeah, it is pretty soon. And so the market has already decided that that's happening, and they've started to build that into their projections. That's one of the reasons the stock market has started to tick up a little bit more the past couple of weeks. So this is going to happen. And I think that we could see, depending on what occurs after that, because you're going to have an initial modest decrease in interest rates. And then what the Fed's going to do is look and see, okay, is inflation going wild? Because if it is, then we're not going to do it anymore. But if things kind of level out and they don't go crazy, and I think that is what will happen, then they'll do another modest decrease in the following quarter. So by the end of the year, you could see interest rates drop by maybe 0.75 points or something like that. And that will translate to huge, massive savings when you start talking about debt that you have to pay the payments you have to pay on debt, like credit card debt and that kind of thing, as well as housing and mortgage rates and all of that. It's going to affect everything. And I think we're pretty close to that happening.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. Spencer just is informing me that the next Federal Reserve meeting for 2025 is scheduled for Tuesday, September 16th and Wednesday, September 17th of 2025. So that's less than a month from now. So we could see this change happening really in a matter of weeks. And wouldn't that be incredible, especially because President Trump was right about tariffs. He was always going to be right. This was a very meticulously planned out strategy. This was not something he pulled out of his hat. This was not something haphazard. This was not something emotional, the way that the mainstream media always, want to spin their false narratives, making Trump seem like he doesn't know what he's doing. No, he always knew what he was doing with tariffs. And I'm delighted to see this playing out. I want to ask you about a totally different story. Nothing to do with inflation, nothing to do with tariffs. It's about a law that was passed in Washington state. You recently wrote an article about this. It's a very troubling law, but I think that people would appreciate if you break down why this is troubling, because it's a very emotional topic. The law in Washington is regarding mandatory reporting of child abuse. And when I say mandatory reporting of child abuse, there are right now mandatory reporters like social workers and teachers, but this law it broadens the definition to include Catholic priests in the confessional. And this, I think, Justin, is where it gets tricky, because a knee-jerk reaction that even as a Catholic I have is, well, yeah, if even a priest knows about ongoing child abuse, especially child sex abuse, for goodness sake, report that to the police to protect that child. And yet, that's perhaps how those who wrote the law want you to think about it, but that's not really the reality of this law and the incredible danger this poses to religious liberty. So can you break down what this law is and why it is undoubtedly an attack on religious liberty?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's two really big problems with it. The first problem is there is a religious liberty component to it. It is especially true for Roman Catholics, although there are other religious Christian denominations and other religions where confession of some kind is a regular part of what you're supposed to do as part of the religion. And in Roman Catholicism in particular, it is an essential part of the religious practices for Catholics. You have to confess your sins. That is part of what you are required to do as a Catholic. And priests who hear the confessions are required under canon law to keep that a secret. They're not supposed to tell people, and they can actually be removed from their positions if they're caught telling people outside of the confessional what was told to them by a parishioner. They're not allowed to do that. And there are very good reasons for it, because in Catholicism, you have to confess your sins. And if people are afraid to confess, then it's going to raise all sorts of serious problems spiritually. And so if you are requiring, so what this Washington law effectively does, especially for Roman Catholic priests, but there are other Protestant denominations as well that would fall under this, is it requires them to violate their religious beliefs. And it chills the parishioner from actually going into confession and being honest, because they might be afraid of what happens. Now, I think some people would hear this and they would say, well, if they're abusing kids, then I don't even care. Like it doesn't even matter to me.
Which is a natural knee-jerk reaction, I think. And that's, I want you to talk about this, because this is a valid point.
Right. And I think that that's fair. Obviously, in America, you have to balance religious liberty against other social problems, right? And that's part of every kind of, whenever we have a religious liberty question, you're going to have to deal with that issue. But this law in particular has language in it that is so vague that I think it is clearly an attack on especially Roman Catholics. What the law does is it doesn't define a child abuse as merely like sexual child abuse or beating a child physically or something like that, which is how I think most people would imagine it. The words that they use are that there's mandatory reporting for, quote, maltreatment of children, quote, negligent treatment of children, those terms are tied to a child's, quote, welfare, unquote, and health. Now, on the surface, that sounds okay, but when you really start thinking about how broad and vague those terms are, maltreatment, negligent treatment, welfare, health, I mean, that could mean virtually anything. And in the state of Washington, they already have various rules, regulations, guidances put out by the government that define these things in such a way that it would clearly be an attack on certain religious ideas. So, for example, gender identity is one of the things. In the state of Washington, if you're a foster parent, for example, you are not allowed to sort of push your foster child away from a chosen gender identity. You can have that foster child removed from your care because you did that. That would be considered maltreatment or negligent treatment that's harmful to the child's welfare and health, which is how this law defines things. So if you're a parent and you go into a confessional, or you're just talking to a priest or another religious leader and you're saying, look, I'm struggling with this. My child has this idea about gender identity and I don't agree with it and I don't know what to say. And what do I tell my child? theoretically, under this law, depending on how it's interpreted, that pastor, that priest, that other religious leader could be required to go to the state and say, hey, even though I don't think that this is child abuse, technically under this law, I have to report this because this could be considered child abuse by you. Now obviously that's horrible. And why would they write it in such a vague way? Why not just specifically lay out physical, abuse, sexual abuse? Why not just say that? Well, I think we all know why, because they want it to be broad so that the government can be more involved in what's going on in people's homes. And I think that this is just incredibly dangerous. And again, going back to the chilling effect argument I made earlier, who's going to want to go into the confessional booth, or who's going to want to talk to their pastor about these kinds of very real problems that people are dealing with if they know they could be reported to the government as a result of it?
Yeah, it's turning priests into government informants. And whether or not you're Catholic, in a sense, doesn't matter right here, because Catholic doctrine says that if you commit a mortal sin, in the Bible, it's called a deadly sin. It separates you from Christ. It puts your soul in a state of eternal damnation until you confess and are forgiven of that sin, at which time you are reunited with Christ. So this is a matter in Catholic doctrine of the state of someone's eternal soul. And if they're afraid to go and confess, repair their relationship with Christ, be reunited with him, then this could be, in a sense, relegating people to eternal damnation. Again, I know Protestants don't necessarily believe and practice that doctrine, but I know Protestants understand what Catholics believe and understand the importance of protecting the practice of the Catholic faith. In addition to the fact, your example that you gave about a parent talking to a priest in a confessional, it could be even worse than that. A child, a teenager struggling with gender identity who'd been raised Catholic, so maybe they are aware that gender identity contradicts natural law. They could be confessing to having dabbled in gender ideology, and the priest could report their parents for not affirming their gender identity. This is bananas. In addition to the fact, and I'd like you to expound on this if you could, this is certainly undoubtedly an attack on religious people, religious belief, religious practice, and clergy, because there are actually exemptions in this law. There are other professionals who don't have the duty of mandatory reporting. This is just targeting priests.
Yeah, that's right. There are exceptions. One of the biggest exceptions is lawyers, who I think we could all agree probably not more important than your pastor in a lot of ways, but they built that in because there's client attorney privilege and stuff like that, and they want to make sure that people, and you know what, I think it's probably a good thing in a lot of ways, because you do need to be able to have attorney client privilege, but it just shows you that they're not absolutists on this, that they're deliberately kind of picking on religious leaders. And just to be clear, it's not just inside of a confessional. It's in any kind of context. So even if you just talked to a pastor or to a priest for advice about something and you bring it up and it's not in a confessional, that's still part of this law. They have to do it. And so there was a lawsuit. 3 Catholic bishops sued, saying this is a First Amendment violation. A federal court has already put a stay on part of this. There's an injunction, so they're not allowed to enforce part of the law, but only the parts of the law that are related specifically to the sacramental elements of the Catholic faith. So in other words, if you're just talking to your priest outside of a confessional booth, that's still not protected, even under the recent court injunction. So we are a long way away from winning this argument, but I think it's unquestionably a First Amendment violation. As you pointed out earlier, you cannot practice the Catholic faith in particular correctly. It's not possible if this law goes into place, at least not in an exhaustive way. And so I don't know how anyone could argue that that's not a First Amendment violation. It clearly is.
Yeah. And I think when I hear you explain it in this way, it also makes it very clear that this is not the cut and dry definition of, if you are aware of ongoing child sex abuse, then you are mandated to report that to authorities. That's not what this law is at all. It has very broad, very vague, very undefined words, welfare and health, because we know the other side uses those words. They claim that abortion is healthcare. They claim that for a teenager's well-being, you have to undergo genital mutilation surgery and call a boy a girl. We know that they have weaponized these words, and it's those very words that are used in this piece of legislation. So
Right.
Christians across the country, conservatives, you should feel no compunction about opposing this bill. In fact, it's your duty to identify these sort of wolves in sheep's clothing type legislation so that religious liberty is not fundamentally damaged in the United States. And I really appreciate, Justin, you bringing attention to this law, because I confess my first pass at looking at this law, I almost fell for those words. I was like, well, if they know about ongoing child sex abuse. And then I was like, oh, wait a second. That's not what this is. So really appreciate your work on all of that. And of course, breaking down the numbers on inflation. It was good to talk to you, my friend. Thank you
It
for
was
being
great
here
to
on the
see you,
show
Liz.
today.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. We'll talk to you soon on a day that's not, Taylor Swift's special day.
Let's hope so.
All right. Coming up next, if you want to hear my take on Taylor Swift's engagement, then you're going to have to head over to my Instagram, because I'll be posting it over there shortly. We do not have time for it in today's show. However, I do want to show you one thing before we run out of time, and that is this. Isn't this a beaut? This right here in front of you is Frontier magazine. And you can get your hands on it. You can get your hands on it and you should. Because in a world that's gone fully digital, holding something real, tangible, beautiful in your hands feels almost countercultural. It feels revolutionary. And that's the point of Frontier magazine. It's a piece of history that you can touch. It's a tangible, lasting record of truth in a time when truth is too easily erased. You don't have to worry about revisionist history in your children's textbooks when you have Frontier magazine. You can hand this down generation after generation and say, if you want to know what was really happening during that time, you read about it right in here. And look at how beautifully this is done. Beautifully, this is done. If you want to own Frontier, the only way to get it is through Blaze Unlimited. Blaze Unlimited is more than just your ticket to Frontier. You get early access to exclusive events, VIP treatment, members-only content, and a premium experience built for people who want to take their membership deeper. This is not just about reading the truth. It's about owning it. Go to blazeunlimited.com/Liz right now and lock in your subscription before we sell out again. The first 50 subscribers who use the code BLAZE50 will get $40 off and receive a special bonus, digital access to Frontier issue 1 and 2, so that you can complete the story from the start. That's blazeunlimited.com/Liz, promo code BLAZE50. All right, guys, make sure you're subscribed to the show, youtube.com/Liz Wheeler, x.com/Liz_Wheeler. Go to Spotify, search The Liz Wheeler Show, hit subscribe, and leave us a 5-star review. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.